Hello, welcome to some Derps Talk About Games. I'm your co-host, Mango.
And I am your co-host, Buddy.
And today we're going to talk a little bit about, how do we want to put this, like itemization in video games versus tabletop games?
Yeah, I guess so. Let me just walk you through.
Before you do that, Buddy, why don't you tell the folks at home what it is we do on this podcast?
Okay, fair enough. On this podcast, we like to talk about games. And if you tuned in last week and heard that I was going back to Dragon Age Inquisition, right? Like a big open world, very classically structured Western RPG crafting. You fight dragons, right? There's a main story quest, but there's lots of side quests, all this other kind of stuff. I found myself playing Dragon Age Inquisition this week, and I'm at like hour 50, and I'm pretty deep into the end game. I think I have one mission left before I fight the big bad guy or whatever. And I was running around killing each of the dragons, right? There was like a quest on my tracker that was like, kill the 10 high dragons in Thedas, or whatever it was called. And I was killing these dragons to get Dragonbone, which as far as I'm aware is the only tier 4 metal and is the only thing that can be used to make the very best weapons in the game, so that I could craft myself an incredibly powerful sword, so that I am like decked out in the most powerful sword. And I eventually realized, as I was maybe like 3 or 4 hours kind of like deep into this quest, that this was truly emergent gameplay, in the sense that it was purely a result of the game's systems that were kind of like urging me on this way, right? I knew I had a very powerful tier 3 recipe, and that if I could get all of the dragon bone I needed, I could make myself an incredibly powerful sword. I knew that Dragon Bone drops from dragons, which are hard boss encounters, typically 1 per zone, that needs to be kind of scouted out and found, and then you get the right potions, and you make sure that your guys with your potions can resist fire, or resist cold, or resist lightning, whatever it is. And then, and then actually go and craft the weapon with the appropriate leather and the appropriate cloth and all of these other kinds of things. And the thought that occurred to me wasn't about how this affected my video game playing, but actually how rare this feeling was when it came to Dungeons and Dragons. Now, I have a theory about this, but that's the genesis. That's what's got me started on this path, because in D&D, we never really think about, or perhaps a more apt way to put it is, we never really allow this sort of thing to happen for players, right? When players get focused on stuff like this, it's seen as like a distractor or a detractor, and typically there's some effort to kind of like get people back on like the rails, right? So like, so in Dragon Age Inquisition, I was killing this dragon to get dragon bone to create a weapon, right? But in Dungeons and Dragons, when I kill a dragon, it's almost always because it's harassing a village, or something else kind of along those lines that's like plot related, rather than like purely sort of like mechanics driven. And I'm just really interested. I'm just like really, really interested in that, and how all of that stuff works.
Yeah, well, I think kind of it's kind of like the opening volley in this. I think the primary thing is we were talking about this very briefly before we hit the record button, but essentially there's no, like the way I expressed it before we got into this, there's no grinding in tabletop games, and I think kind of the kind of more relevant thing is that there's no kind of extraneous combat, if that makes sense, right? Like, like I could theoretically see a thing like this, right? Like you want to gather the materials to craft like a legendary sword, right? Like if you got a smith in your party or one in town, but that in itself becomes a quest that has its own like story arc to it. Yeah. It's not like it would never be emergent, because it's not. First of all, I think part of this goes to like kind of crafting as a system in games, which or in tabletop games, which is generally bad. Like Pathfinder does it all through money, so it doesn't matter what you're doing. And it's kind of just like it's a time resource. That's the other thing, right? Like time tends to not actually matter in video games, but it does matter in tabletop games.
I actually think that is the fundamental bedrock of all of this. I think the reason that there is no grinding in tabletop RPGs is because of time. And not like in game time, but I mean real time, right? Like me having to... Okay, so for instance, this is something that happened, right? I went to a dragon fight because I read I just thought it was a cold dragon. I fought 2 cold dragons in the area, and I was like, well, obviously the 3rd dragon in the area must be a cold dragon also. So I went back to my base, and I equipped myself with all this cold stuff, and then I went to the nearest camp. And then I went to the dragon, and I had a couple of like random encounters, and I defeated those random encounters. And then I saw the dragon, and I read its like stat table, and it's like, oh, actually it's cold vulnerable, and this is a fire dragon. And so I went all the way back to my base, got fire potions, went through random encounters, and then got to the fire dragon. Now that whole thing, it took me almost longer to explain it here than it did in game, because fast traveling is a thing, right? It is very quick for me in an end game state to be dealing with these kind of random guys, right? They take, 30 seconds or whatever? But every round in D&D costs a ton of time, right? Every random encounter costs a ton of time. So I think even if we were to say that what I'm essentially doing in Dragon Age is grinding, right? Which is kind of true. The penalty to the grind is so much different because I'm wasting, 2 minutes at a time on each of these fights. Whereas in tabletop, we'd be wasting 45 minutes, hypothetically speaking.
Yeah. So I think that I think that component's very real. I think it's mitigatable. I think that the other side of this, which is kind of like in world time, is also a big factor, right? Like it's not always a factor, right? Not every campaign has like the bad guy knocking down the door, but a lot of them do, right? Like I think that like if you wanted to identify why this isn't the case in most games, I think that you could point to half or more approximately of games do have like in-game kind of pressures to like do things now that don't wait because you decided to go fuck off in a meadow to like kill hares until you had enough hair bones to make something. What's the end? You're absolutely right that like having combat for combat itself doesn't. How do I want to put this? Generic combat isn't fun in D&D, I think, or like it gets to a point where it's not, right? Like you don't like combat is like it's this kind of weird love-hate relationship because combat's kind of like the mechanical core of a lot of D&D and Pathfinder, but it's also like if it's like boring combat is the worst, right? It is a drain on the game. It's a drain on the table. That seems like a fairly decent definition of the problem, right? Like that there's in world and in real life constraints on time. There's not a great system to back it up, not a great crafting system to back it up to make it worth it. And those are the two big things. I also think that I think part of the problem too is the way you get items in D&D is typically like random rolls at a shop or like a curated list, right? Yeah. Like there's not a lot because crafting is so bad. It's mostly instant gratification anyway, right? It's not like this is Diablo where you're like reprocking bosses to get better dope drops.
So yeah, and so interestingly, I also think that there comes pressure sort of like from the other side, which is that typically items in D&D are more So I'm thinking about a player that resembles a lot of friend of the cast Nick, right? Who stats out his character all the way through all 20 levels, and knows what feats he's going to get and what level ups or whatever. And part of that is finding the items, and he says, oh, well, here I'm going to use the gold that I make from leveling up to buy a flaming dagger, and then I'm going to upgrade that flaming dagger at level 11 for a flame burst dagger, or, like, whatever it is, sort of thing. And so there's a certain amount of, like, I kind of wonder, so part of why I wonder so much about this is I've talked before about, like, the plans in my head for doing an entirely opposite game to what Hell's Rebels is, right? Very narratively driven, in doing something that is much more kind of like environmentally driven, in Pathfinder 2nd edition, where you get lots of there isn't much of a main quest. The main quest is kind of chart this uncharted land, right? So you can take your time and do sort of whatever you want, but there's all these plot hooks everywhere that people will follow. But I would wonder if Nick were playing in that game, and I included a plot hook that was like, the locals have a legend about a sword in a lake, and if you go to the lake and you do a thing, the lady of the lake is going to give you a sword, right? I wonder how much that would attract a player like Nick, who would go, hey man, I'm sure that sword is very cool, but I already know that I'm getting a flame burst sword at level 12, so why bother? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I think part of it too, like, I think part of the thing that you're talking about is also, like, known kind of game space, right? Like, we know what items are in Pathfinder, right? Like,
yeah.
When the first time you're playing through a video game, you generally don't know what you can build,
definitely.
right? So, like, you have the ability to plan that out in a Pathfinder or a D&D game.
Yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, I was planning that out because I understood that Dragonbone was the most powerful metal, and I needed to, or I wanted to get as much of it as possible in crafting that weapon. But I didn't, I also think that there's a certain amount of it that, like, in Dungeons and Dragons, there is more, because the numbers are simpler, they're a lot easier to parse compared to something where all of the calculations are being back-ended by a computer, right? In Dragon Age Inquisition, it's a lot easier for me to boil it down and say, you know what, if I just make my best quality schematic with my best quality metal, that will leave me with the best quality sword I'm ever going to craft, right? But in D&D, that sort of thing is, like, a lot tougher to, like, that kind of sweet spot is a lot tougher to find.
Yeah, I think it's also one of these things where, like, it's how do I want to put this? There's no side content in D&D, right? Like, it's not like, even if you do something that's quote unquote optional in D&D, it's only as optional as you, like, let it be, right? Like, it's not like there's, like, a theoretical other party that's, like, or another player that's going through the same game and doing something different with their time, right? Like, so it plays off of itself in weird ways. I think part of this, I think something that you've kind of hit on with this, parsability of numbers thing is because the computer backends a lot of the combat for you. You have the ability to make items, like, more interesting generally. Not that there aren't interesting items in Pathfinder, but, like, you can kind of let the computer do that work for you, so you can do, like, different things with items. I think another part of this too is because the thought space around the items is relatively kind of unknown, like, relatively unknown to Pathfinder, right? Like, you've got, like, 7,000 nerds on the internet telling you what the best items for your D&D character are, and I'm sure there's similar stuff for Dragon Age, but almost in a sense, it's like it's not as important in Dragon Age because it's, like, a single player experience.
Yeah.
And you it's almost like in Pathfinder and D&D, it is rarely the case where you kind of have some options put out in front of you, which would be like loot or like schematics, you know, like a crafting menu or whatever that you get in a video game,
Right.
and you get to choose from among them, right? In D&D, it's much more either you only have kind of like the loot that you get, or you kind of have the whole panopticon of all of the items that have ever been in D&D ever. And that like allows for a lot kind of like more extreme specialization. And it's one of those things. It's one of those things where like, because everything's in gold rather than in any sort of crafting material, it's not like, oh, I have 5 dragon bones. What's the best thing I can make with 5 dragon bones until I can find 5 mithril ore or whatever? It's
I mean, I kind of wish that system, like, I feel like you probably could do a system like that in D&D.
Yeah,
and it would be neat to see something kind of along those lines, like in Pathfinder 2nd Edition or whatever else.
Angry GM is writing a series of articles about a better crafting system. He's not very far in it, so not a lot to talk about. But he raises a lot of these kind of concerns, a little bit more on the practical end.
Because I think it has some real challenges. You know, in a lot of ways, I would probably say that this is something that is better homebrewed than anything else. Just because, like, you know, can you guarantee? Like, I think it would be frustrating playing in a game where you need Sun Silver to make a Sun Silver Saber, which is like the best in slot, you know, scimitar or whatever, but your game is in, you know, Bravoy, and Sun Silver is a mineral that only exists in the northern mountains of Garund or something like that. And it's like, well, what do you do with that? You know what I mean? Those kinds of things like would be frustrating in a way.
Yeah, I feel like it wants to be like you kind of have an idea of what you want, and it kind of falls into this quest paradigm, right? Like, because you can't like you could say like, you know, well, I'd like to make my Sun Silver scimitar, right? And so the GM can then be like, well, do some research, and then like when like scatter around, and some locals like, oh, I heard there's an abandoned Sun Silver mine to the north, right? Like that becomes like a quest, right? But that falls out of kind of like the natural crafting paradigm that you get in video games.
Yeah. Where you're just like wandering through the world, right? Like I can imagine a version of things like, let's say in like this Uncharted game or whatever, where like every time you discover a hex, you discover herbs and ore and leather, you know what I mean? Like, and it's like, these are all the crafting materials that you've discovered in this hex sort of thing. So that you can like, let's say you have it on your map and you say, okay, I want to craft myself some new leather armor, and I need to go get, you know, like dire bear hide. Oh, well, we scouted this hex and we saw that there are dire bears here, so this is where we can go get it. You know what I mean? Like, I think that system would be interesting, but I think it just like wouldn't get enough use to justify it to itself. You know what I mean? Like, you would really have to work hard on a homebrew crafting system to justify that kind of level of commitment.
Yeah, I think part of this too is what we were talking about a little bit with like, you know, like this, like, you know, like, well, all the Sun Silvers in Garund or whatever. It's that you need either complete new players or you need a complete kind of divergence from the expected from like the known item set, because at that point it's like, you know, it's not like I get to discover something, I get to do this cool new thing. No, it's like I have to jump through these dumb, stupid hoops to get my normal +1 dagger.
Well, and I think that there's also a question of kind of like, to what extent can you reward the delayed gratification?
Yeah.
So for instance, right, let's say it is a much more generalized thing, right? You buy a schematic maybe, and the schematic is for good armor, but you don't know what it does or whatever, and you have all the different pieces of it. And it's one of those things that you're not necessarily hoping for, but like when it pops up, you're like, oh, that's very cool, right? You know, you need dire bear leather in order to complete the schematic. And so as you're exploring, oh, we hit dire bear leather, great. let's take like a quick trip to go kill a dire bear so I can skin it and add that to kind of my like list of whatever. And let's say that this takes place over a certain amount of time, but like it's not a driving quest, right? It's just kind of background to the other stuff that you're doing. Well, to a certain extent, I want to say that like in that instance, whatever the reward is should be very high, right? Because like it's something it's something that's taking a long time in order to complete, right, with a bunch of different kind of like disparate steps that requires a certain amount of sort of like, exploration. But at the same time, doesn't that kind of like open up the like, I guess the same path for abuse that we see in other places and in other ways, where someone looks at that and they say, oh, my only goal is to find dire bear stuff, and if we explore a hex and don't find dire bear leather, we have to immediately explore another hex, and that's all we're doing with our time. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I also think that like even if in the case where it's like an entirely passive system, it's kind of no better than random drop loot, just because if it's something that you only ever do when you're on your way somewhere, then it's kind of like getting like and like the recipes are like things you have access to. It's kind of like you might as well just give it to them as a random drop at that point, because like it's like it's not like you're making any choices to go capture that stuff. It's like you're just taking the extra step of quote unquote crafting an item while you're along the way. Where you follow what I'm saying?
I definitely feel that
throwing in like another weird mechanical step for the same end. But I do feel like the right way to do this is like you kind of have like an idea of what you want. I think what you want is kind of like it's work. But it's the same, Mark put a lot of work into his kind of like relic weapons type of thing. You want kind of to give the players the freedom to kind of mark out a thing that they directly want, that's kind of above and beyond the normal way that items work, and then make that kind of like potentially its own focus, right? Like you make it its own kind of arc, if that makes sense. The only kind of thing there is that it feels like one of these problems is like it's a thing that like if not either everybody has to get one, or maybe if only one person is really on board, like the fighter wants his very special sword, but like if the wizard doesn't care, is he just kind of along for the ride for a whole quest?
Oh yeah, it's this whole other thing. Yeah, like you hear the quest about the Lady of the Lake, but if you're a wizard, why the fuck do you want to go on that quest? Right. I mean, in a single player RPG or whatever, right? Like even in Dragon Age, even if I find a weapon that I can't use on my main character, I'm at least managing the inventories for the rest of my party. Like maybe fucking, whatever, Cassandra can like carry that shit. But I feel like that's not something that feels as good in D&D because we're all selfish people. And
so I think it's less being being selfish, right? Because I think you've got a point. I think that there's like a level of this where it's like, well, just be happy. Like you go get the sword for Lady of the Lake. That way, Arthur, your party member, is more powerful, even if you're Merlin. But at the same time,
I appreciate the lengths that we're going to uphold this metaphor.
But at the same time, right? Like that necessarily means that Arthur's in the spotlight for that entire arc, right? And to kind of continue this on, right? In the story, in the legend of King Arthur is center, and Merlin is kind of a side character, and that's fine for that story, but it's not fine for like a collaborative storytelling group experience.
And I think there's an answer to that. Like a hypothetical answer to that is like, okay, well maybe this is only like one session deep, right?
Yeah, I see what you're saying.
Go back to town, and oh hey, there's this like side quest available, and you can go on this side quest kind of whenever, and the party is trying to figure out what they want to do, and Arthur's like, hey guys, can we go do the Lady of the Lake quest? I really want to get that sword, and everyone's kind of like, fine. But in that instance, I actually kind of feel like then the sword can't be all that powerful, because it, you know, if it's a one and done sort of thing, like it doesn't feel like a big reward for a big, you know, like a big progressive arc anymore. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, no, I see what I see what you're saying. It's also one of those things where, like, if it is a big reward, you have to have a balancing factor for everybody else in the party, because, you know, it's essentially, you know, no one likes being not the great guy in the party, right? Like, everybody wants to be good at least their thing. And you could do that by, like, you know, Arthur gets Excalibur, and then, like, Merlin gets like 4 wands, right? But, like, at some point, are you running into kind of weirdness there, because the wands are kind of all random, you know, apparently random drops, and, like, you know, how much are you pigeonholing Arthur by giving him?
Yeah, or do you just make everything like really vague or whatever? It's like, oh well, there's some weapon in the lake, and it just happens to be a sword. So, like, your sorcerer and your rogue, who were both hoping that it was, you know, a bow and it was a staff, respectively, get kind of fleeced.
I think like, kind of all in all, that if you're going to, like, if it's a specific quest for a thing, what that thing is has to be fairly clear, right? Like, it's, you know, if you've got a sword wielder, a bow user, and you know, like a wizard, and you go and it's like, oh, there's a legendary weapon in the mountain. It's like, great. It's a fucking, you know, like, it's a fucking spear. None of us use the shit, right? Like, that's going to be not so great.
And I think, and like, zooming out, right? Okay, so, like, that's just one instance, but hypothetically speaking, I'm talking about a campaign that is driven in a lot of ways by this mechanism, right? And so, if that's the case, at what point do you futz with it in order to, like, justify the quest, right? Like, you know, if I'm building right now without any knowledge of what the party kind of, like, looks like, maybe I'd put a spear as a legendary weapon in the mountain, and none of you can use it, right? Or even worse, you get there and the spear user doesn't want to use it. Or even worse, you get there and the spear user just got another crazy spear off of a similar side quest that you never expected the players to do back to back, right? That happens all the time in video games, right? One of the things that I keep experiencing in Dragon Age as I kind of, like, end up finding my way back in places that I out-level is I'll end up kind of passively completing certain of these side quests, right? And you're like, boy, if I came here when I was level 7, this would be fucking awesome. But I'm, like, level 18, and this, you know, this, like, great axe is completely worthless to me. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I feel like that is a much more acceptable thing in Dragon Age than it is in D&D. I think if that happened in D&D, people would be really pissed.
So I also think that, like, you're kind of, like, sideways highlighting another part of this problem, which is that, like, there is no level in D&D where you're level 18 and it's level 7, unless, like, it's supposed to be, right? Like, it's, like, to put this another way, right? Like, let's say you have to go kill the dragon. That's, like, the ultimate end goal of your campaign. And, like, along the way you hear about this, like, magic sword in the mountain that could really help you kill this dragon, right? Like, I think part of the issue is that, like, in a video game, it's like, oh, getting that sword will definitely make the dragon easier to kill. Like, I can go play it without the sword. I can go play it with the sword and see how much easier it is once I have the sword. In D&D, it's kind of like, regardless of whether I get the sword or not, the dragon's got to be at some level beatable in order for, like, this to work. And so, like, I feel like that's kind of, like, baked in, like, the expectation that, like, the challenges in front of you are mountable, regardless. And I think that really screws with this a lot, if that makes sense.
You know, I'm kind of coming around to an idea that says, like, maybe you could do this in D&D. You would just have to, like, be really clear with the party that, like, listen, we're going to be breaking a lot of the, you know, the kind of conventions, and you need to be, like, kind of okay with that. Because I do actually kind of like the idea in this kind of, in a kind of, like, plotless game, so to speak, where you show up and there's a dragon and you fight the dragon a little bit and it gets pretty rough. but you run away.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Running away in a plot game is really bad because almost always you need to stop the bad guy from doing the bad thing or else the world will end or something kind of invariably along those kinds of lines. But like in a game structured a little bit more like this, like, yeah, maybe it's not the worst thing in the world if you say, okay, well, we're going to leave and we're going to come back later. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Or like, like maybe there is plot there, but it's not like it's like, the dragon's always going to be there, and if you show up again, he'll be like, "Oh, it's you again," right, or whatever. But you just can't be like that internal time pressure that we were talking about. I think that's
I like the idea of the dragon, of going back to the dragon, and he looks at you and he's like, "You," you know what I mean? Like,
but I think a big part. I think what we're stumbling into here is that I think there's a fundamental problem with.
Yeah,
like getting players to run away, right? Like,
we've talked about that before.
Yeah,
and to a certain extent, I almost wonder how much of this is just like baked in or whatever. Because like in a certain sense, maybe like running away. I think running away in Dragon Age doesn't feel as bad because there's not much like quote unquote sunk cost on the line. In the sense that, like, for instance, if I run away from the dragon because I'm like, oh, I have the wrong potions, whatever, I come back a second later, right? But if I run away from the dragon in D&D, that's like 30 minutes that's just like down the hole, you know what I mean? Just because, like, even if we go 1 or 2 rounds of combat with the dragon to figure out what its breath weapon is so that we can get the right kind of, like, gear or whatever, those rounds just take a while. And I feel like, coming away with that with just, like, some scraps of knowledge just wouldn't be enough.
Yeah. I think you'd have to play the whole game. Like, I think what you actually really want is to kind of like set the game up like this and have like early encounters that like murder characters until they learn that they have to run away. Like,
yeah.
So something like that, right? Which is its own kind of mess, but like
I do have to say that I think it would be it would be a lot easier to murder characters in this framework than in other frameworks.
Yeah.
Just because like there's not going to be like a fate of the world. You know what I mean? You don't really need to uphold relationships with somebody. Like if you're out in the wilderness and your only goal is to Lewis and Clark, essentially, right? And you die, it's not like you lose. It's not like you lose all of the connections to that person's like deep and storied backstory or kind of like whatever, right? And all the NPCs that person has like befriended, because that kind of stuff doesn't really exist in a game like this compared to a game like Hell's Rebels, where any one of the main party dying would carry pretty serious consequences because everyone is wrapped up in the politics.
Yeah, I feel like if somebody died in Hell's Rebels, they'd almost have to like play one of the secondary like they'd have to play like Ralph or I can't remember any of the other characters because it's been too long since we played that game.
No, for real. But like in a sort of in this kind of like exploration game, right? You wouldn't need to like worry about that kind of stuff. I think to a certain extent, I almost sort of fear that without the driving issue of the plot, people might just like run into like choice paralysis. You know what I mean? Like, if you just keep kind of racking up side quests over and over and over again, like, will the party, like, commit to something, or will they just kind of be like, I don't know what to do just this one? Do you know what I mean?
I think it's not so much of a problem if the tone is set right. By the way, I don't think this game works well online. I think this game is something that has to be done in person.
Okay.
Just because, like, I think plot can, like, kind of, like, force people, like, who can, like, kind of drive people who aren't paying attention well forward. But I think that, like, playing in person kind of, like, gets rid of a lot of these kind of wiggly issues. You can get people to be like, oh, boy, I want to explore the next thing. And I think even in this kind of Lewis and Clarky thing, you want plot hooks that maybe just aren't as kind of big and interposing, right? Like I think Kingmaker did this fairly well. The real, like the tabletop version. that it was good at kind of like you're exploring for the sake of exploring, for mapping out this stuff, and there's cool stuff to do along the way. I think it's just it's weird because like I don't know, this is a concept of like content completeness that I think I think that maybe our group has just played adventure paths for too long. We haven't really ever played a campaign that's just kind of been like, adventure of the week type stuff, right? And I think that that really has to like be like the thing that you're doing the game for. I think that you have like, I think kind of given our relative life positions, if this makes sense, that like, when we're getting game, we're like getting stuff done, right? Like, because, our time is of some value. In that sense, I think that like, if we all live geographically proximate and then, every Saturday we came by and shot the shit for a couple hours while we did some like, weird bozo dungeoneering. This feels like much more a beer and pretzels type thing, if that makes sense. Right. Like, and that's the right venue for this kind of thing where like, you're constantly kind of building your characters up and, and maybe there's some plot points along the way, but it's much more kind of like about like these weird fellowship things, right? Like, a lot of kind of the drama in the game is going to come from like your characters interacting with each other and like little bits of the outside world, but it's largely going to be player driven. And you're just kind of like, as the GM, you're just kind of like generating kind of things to do that kind of let things happen where like, like kind of like a, how do I want to put this? Like a simulator almost, right? Like a Minecraft or something, or a Skyrim.
Yeah. No, yeah. So I think in a certain sense, kind of like that Skyrim is the fantasy, and maybe you could definitely get that done. And I think to a certain extent, like Critical Role or like a lot of those kinds of structures for games get that done. Done that way. So like like moving away from adventure paths and having adventures be like a little bit more impromptu, I guess. Yeah. I don't know. I've been thinking about this stuff like. I've been thinking about this stuff like quite a bit. I feel like so much of it just boils down to the difference between a 2-minute combat and a 45-minute combat. It's just like we call these things RPGs, and they do have a lot of similarities, but because like the second to second of it is so different, it is kind of tough.
Yeah. Honestly, I feel like this might be a place where like eventually the computer games will catch up, right? Like I feel like this is almost a thing where like you want to like play Skyrim, multiplayer Skyrim in character, if that makes sense, right? Like you want to be like, or like play like Monster Hunter in characters, like, oh, we want to go like kill fucking Ampharos today. Ampharos is a Pokemon, but you know what I mean. We want to go kill Ampharos today. It's like, oh, okay, but like instead of doing it as like 4 gamers, you're doing it as like 4 Monster Hunters. It's like, yes, Gimli, we will go and slay the mighty beast, so I might gather a new string for my bow. And I think that's kind of the path you want to take with that kind of stuff to get it there. And I think that's much better facilitated by kind of like stuff that a GM doesn't have to handle so much, right? Like, or you can I think computer games will eventually get there for us, right? Where it's like this feels like sandboxy MMO type stuff.
Yeah, because I really like playing these sorts of sandbox games. Like, I really enjoy playing Dragon Age, and I enjoy that I can kind of be doing the main quest or whatever, but then I can also go back and go, to I don't know, just like finding your own goals in the game. Like, this isn't even getting into kind of like collectibles, which is something that's in Dragon Age, and something that I actually like in Dragon Age. like there are those astrariums where you do the constellations, and there's like one or two, actually I think there's like three or so in a zone. And those three will then point to a cave that gets unlocked, and you go to the secret location of the secret cave, and you get a super cool, crazy weapon or something like that. You know what I mean? Like, so it's maybe it's not just that there's the sword in the lake, but there are the astrariums, and there are like the shards and the oculariums or whatever. And there are closing the fade rifts and all of these other kinds of things that like kind of compound into a, like a deep, well-stocked sandbox. And to a certain extent, I kind of like wonder how much of that is possible in a D&D game when you essentially have one developer who can't be a computer. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Like, I think it requires a lot of like pre-work by the GM, right? Like he has to like have like enough of the world kind of built out. I know that I forget what the style's called, but there's a style of game where essentially you do this, but like you let the GM know ahead of time kind of what you're going to do, and he has the opportunity to plan out what that is before you actually sit down at the table. But I think that's kind of what you're aiming for, right? Like that there's enough of a world out there that's built out enough for like has enough elements in it that you can be like oh, like the mission is kind of like tame the continent so that the empire can come and settle it. And you've got like vague goals for that, but like everything kind of starts like sort of contributes to that, and so you can just kind of go about that however you want. You can be like, oh, I feel like clearing goblins out of this hovel today, and the GM just has to be able to be prepared for what all of that entails. I feel like you want like kind of like a subsystem on top of that kind of like represents like for this theoretical Lewis and Clark-y type thing, right? Like it's like like continent dominance, and it goes up a couple of points regardless of what you do. You get that by exploring or whatnot, and then as you get more dominance points, like the city where you landed, like the city that you're building where you landed gets bigger, and you get more resources, and you can do more stuff there.
Yeah. No, I think that's actually very a cool piece of it. That's one of the things that I like a lot about Dragon Age Inquisition is like you're running around the world and you'll run into a bridge, and then that bridge will be there'll be like a thing at the bridge, and then you go back to your war table and it's like, hey, do you want to repair this fucking bridge and go to the other side? And you're like, yeah, that's awesome. That's neat. And I feel like those kinds of pieces to games like this are the pieces that you're looking to like really maximize,
Yeah.
Because in a certain sense, there are no borders. If there's ever a cliff or something like that, like you and the party can just climb down it, and I feel like that feels good.
Yeah. I think kind of the secret sauce there is what you want is you want like to find a bridge that's out, and you want to find like like a monster hovel, and then when you get back to town, it's like, well, the bridge is out, and you can repair the bridge, so you could focus on gathering, doing something that lets you go gather wood for that or whatever, materials for that. Or you could go clean out the goblin hovel, or there's like another hex that you haven't explored yet, so you could go do that. And it's kind of like, well, what do we feel like doing today, right? Like that type of thing. That can kind of drive those choices and let it kind of be like a naturally evolving kind of thing.
Yeah.
I also think part of what you want to make this like to like harness what like essentially I think part of the, just to kind of take a step back, part of the danger here is like you don't want to hew too close to video game systems, because at some point why aren't you just playing a video game? Because of the things that it does do better. So I think you want like things on kind of like, you want things that kind of do expire, right? Like you want like, like this kind of like hovel that's, this monster den. It's like, if you don't deal with it soon enough, it'll overrun and you'll kind of like, revert this area to wilderness. You won't have as much dominance over that, but you want it to be such that like you can't fix every option, right? Like you can't do everything. It's kind of, but nothing so severe that you like feel bad that you didn't get to it. Just kind of like, well, that's the way it went, type of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I also think part of it is about like the design of the monsters themselves. One of the things that I think is important about any of these kinds of interactions is the ability for players to kind of like learn as they go. So, so for instance, when you fight a bear at level 3 and when you fight a dire bear at level 9, they are both using mechanics that you can kind of like recognize and incorporate later down the line, in the same way that like, dragons are the obvious example of this because they have breath weapons, right? So you can be like, oh well, don't clump up and he won't fucking use a breath weapon to kill all of us, sort of thing. But I feel like that's something that has to be with like everything in a way in order to make a game like this work, because otherwise the barrier to doing the exploration to get the items right and allowing your gameplay to be emergent from just sort of the systems that you set up. You also need to kind of like make sure that the challenges that people are fighting aren't constantly brand new, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I feel, I mean, maybe that's just general all-purpose advice and should always be. That's something I'm doing in House Rebels, and I think that's something that's important in standard kind of storyline D&D as well. But yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think really it comes back to this like. So I'm thinking to myself, like, well, what kind of drives a lot of this behavior in video games as well as, like, when you screw up, you die, but then you, like, load a save, or then you respawn, and then you go try and tackle it a different way. And the equivalent to that has to be running away. And so you have to make running away not only, like, a kind of, like, expected tactic, but it also has to be, like, fairly viable, right? Like, part of the problem with like say like a dragon is if you start to run away, like how far does the dragon chase you, right? Like how do you get yourself out of that situation? At what point do you end up just like standing and fighting anyway? And it's not necessarily at what point you end up standing and fighting, but at what point does kind of the knowledge that you might have to stand, like that the dragon's going to outrun you and you have to stand and fight, and because it's a situation, the DM has to make the encounter kind of beatable, affect how you play the game, right? Like this is like seven layers of player interaction meta. And
you always have to be thinking about like what do the death mechanics look like? If being able to run away is the sort of D&D version of like save and continue, right? Like quick save spamming. At what point does what happens if somebody gets caught in the crossfire and dies?
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And they have to like roll a new character. What stats can they use? Can they roll, can they just do the thing where it's like, oh, well,
I'm Steve
character...
too.
Exactly. Right. Like, can they do that? Do you have to a rule that I commonly enforce is that you have to play a different race class, when you re-roll a character, just so that people don't end up going, oh, well, my human wizard died. And oh, well, did you look at that? Here's a human wizard who wants to join the party. And so it's like, how is death punishing in that way, and is that bad? It really upends a lot of your preconceived notions about D&D, I think, is kind of what we're explaining slowly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it could work. I also think that like this is like a weird kind of like, I think this is a thing that would like not was more accomplishable with older versions of the game, but just kind of a thing that was a little bit more expected, right? Like I think that there was less expectation that the games would be like, long and epic sagas and more kind of like, like dungeon crawls with connective tissue. I think that's like a thing that has evolved as time has gone on, right? Like it kind of like on the game story spectrum that D&D lies, and I think it's like shifted from game to story more and more, at least in the kind of popular conscious.
So I also think that that's very interesting, and that's something else I think I would like to explore. Like, I like the idea of doing an exploration game where dungeons exist but are kind of true dungeons. Like, okay, could you imagine, for instance, you're exploring and you're finding clues to like this lost dwarven tomb or whatever, and then you find the location of the tomb, but now you need to get 3 keys and you need to go explore and you find the 3 keys. And like, I feel like that is probably one of the coolest and most compelling ways to drag, not drag, but to get a party, you know, kind of like going and hype for a game.
Yeah.
Because in the same way that like the Lady of the Lake kind of rolls into some problems because your wizard doesn't give a shit, I feel like everybody looks at a you know, a pristine, unplundered dwarven tomb and is like, yo, let's fucking loot the shit out of this.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, I feel like that would be very cool.
I also feel like we're starting to sound like, you know, OSR enthusiasts who never knew what the old school was like. OSR being old school revival. Like,
Yeah.
That's like a whole movement in like the tabletop community. It's like, we were never really there, but I think that there's like this, there's like a drive in us to kind of see like go and kind of see that content, as it were. It's weird. I think that part of the reason that this type of content has fallen out of favor as of late is because like the pure dungeon crawling thing is a thing that a video game can do better, right? Like it can kind of tweak those buttons better, and so there's a natural kind of inclination to focus on the things that the tabletop does better, which is kind of like freedom of narrative.
And being able to like really choose how a story goes down.
Yeah, and that kind of thing. I think that just kind of like. I think maybe part of it is like, you know, like it's kind of like a weird false choice syndrome, which is the thing that tabletop games should be avoiding. But it's like, at some point, like you want kind of like your worldview to be expansive enough that like certain paths are just cut off, right? Like, you know, like maybe like, you know, maybe your party never like climbs over this cliff in front of you because none of them can climb very well, or only one of them can. And, you know, either they come back in 30 level or, you know, in 10 levels when they've got enough fly spells to get themselves over the thing. Or they just kind of don't, but that's fine because, you know, in a video game, there has to be content in that direction. In a tabletop game, there really doesn't. And then that's like a thing that like should be more kind of open, right? Like, and then maybe this is I think kind of a trap that a lot of modern gaming has fallen into, where it's like as you're kind of like looking at your toolbox for solving the problems in front of you in a campaign, there's a lot of like, when you see an enemy, it's a combat solution. When you see like a wall, it's a skill check. I think part of this is you know, being experienced players, right? Like, I think new players are a lot better at kind of looking at a situation and be like, well, what if I do this, right? Kind of being freed from the rules in that sense. I don't know. I feel like that's like a thing that would be neat to try and recapture again. You know, I said this before, you know, this is kind of maybe why we always play new stuff at Gen Con, is we're trying to recapture that sense of like never having played a tabletop game before.
Having
like the whole possibility
I very much
space
feel
in front
that.
of you. Items.
I mean, it's tough when it comes to all of these things, because it is so hard to stop yourself from like sort of spiraling out of control. It's such like a basic, you know, like it's such like a core part of the game that once you start to look at it a little sideways and want to redo it, it kind of like unravels the whole sweater and you need to knit the whole thing over again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also like I said, I think part of this is that because it all has to like the way this all gets communicated is through the GM, right? Like with a cooperative computer game, right? Like there's something happening on the screen in front of you, and you can have you don't have to talk all the time because you can see what's happening in front of you, but you don't really get that in D&D, right? Because one of the limitations is that the kind of arbiter of the game has to be controlling what's happening, right? I'm almost thinking that what is the not Beyond Divinity, Divinity Original Sin. That has a GM mode. I'm wondering if that's kind of the protean beginnings of what I'm thinking about, which is somebody builds out some custom some content that you can just kind of interact with without having to have the GM be an active force immediately to kind of understand what's happening, and then you can go through it that way and still have kind of the tabletop elements by having the GM be an active person that can step in when he wants to. I don't know. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have a good answer because it is so hypothetical. But I think it is it's obviously something really neat to kind of consider. And if that was coming out, I really could feel myself, get sort of wrapped up in it. In one sense, I actually sort of fear that something like that would kind of devolve into a Diablo clone.
Yeah.
Which I don't think would be very good. I think, being able to play Skyrim with a big group of people that's an appropriately, kind of tasked thing. Maybe Fallout 76 is sort of a protean example of this. You load into a server with a bunch of other people in it or whatever, and there's a GM person who can spawn stuff and keep track of what you're doing or whatever. That would be a really neat game to kind of that would be a really neat game to see.
Yeah. I feel like what you really want is just a stronger kind of incentive to stay in character. Right?
Yeah. I mean, I will say that there are RP servers for GTA 5 that do this, where they have GMs and stuff like that, and you load into the server and you are expected to be in character at all times, whether as a cop or a criminal or whatever, and all these other sorts of things.
Yeah. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see this moving forward. I do kind of wish that we could I wish that we all lived closer together. That way we could do this stuff more in person.
Yeah.
Speaking of being together in person, for those of you at home that are unaware, Gen Con housing lottery is in 2 weeks. And you should get your shit together. We should get our shit together.
Yeah, I know, for real.
Because we're ending towards, we're trending towards the end of our time. So I think this might be around the right time. Did you have anything else you wanted to say before we transitioned out to the to our weeks?
No, I think that was a very strong discussion.
Yeah, I don't think it was exactly what we started with, but essentially what it's boiled down to is getting the good parts of video game motivations into tabletop games, which is interesting subject. Anyway, besides not planning for Gen Con, what have you done with your week?
So I've been playing a lot of Dragon Age, which we obviously talked a whole bunch about. I just want to take a second to talk about how good this game is. It was my game of the year, whatever year it came out, I remember. But I don't really think I appreciated how good it was until I came back to play it a second time. I feel like all of these BioWare games are, really strong kind of from a narrative, character, sort of thematic point of view. But I don't really think that I got the themes of Dragon Age Inquisition the first time I played it. But the second time I played it, boy, it's all over the place. Because the whole game is about, it's essentially about, it's kind of faith and, atheism versus theism or whatever. And it's, allowing you to kind of explore that space. And this is going to go into some very mild spoilers of the game, so I apologize for folks who haven't necessarily, I'm not going to spoil the ending or anything kind of along those lines, just like some stuff that happens. But like, so in the beginning of the game, right, you walk out of like the Fade, like the otherworldly dimension with all the demons and where magic comes from and all this other sort of shit. And people are constantly telling you, they call you the Herald of Andraste, who is like this world's Jesus. And they're constantly telling you that you were saved by Andraste herself, and all these other sorts of things. And like, you're encouraged to buy in to the, like, you're encouraged to like buy into the narrative because you don't know what happened. Yeah, anything is possible, sort of thing. And it's politically expedient for you because you're founding the Inquisition, which is this political force between Ferelden and Orlais in Thedas, right? The first act of the game ends with the town that you're in being destroyed by like the big bad guy, and all of these people going through this big pilgrimage through the mountains or whatever. And it's actually like a very like heart-wrenching moment when the kind of like everybody's feeling pretty hopeless and dejected, and like the resident priest starts singing this song with the melody of like the Dragon Age theme, and the song is all about having faith in like dark times because of like Andraste and shit. And so like you get a very clear early picture about why faith and like kind of buying into like the religious structure of the world is like a good important idea, right? But then about halfway through the game you find out what happened, and it has nothing to do with being chosen by Andraste or anything like that. Your character is honestly kind of just a random rube who happened to be in the wrong place at the right time, and you got the anchor on your hand because Corypheus butterfingered a ball and you picked it up, and it gave you all of like your super secret like magic powers or whatever. And so it kind of like demystifies the whole thing, but you still have people constantly asking you and talking to you about like your faith, and they're like, oh, are you chosen by Andraste? And it's like, well, I know I wasn't. I know what happened now because my memories got restored or whatever. But do I keep up the lie, right? Like when you tell people
but buddy,
no.
But buddy, were you not, did Andraste not make things happen such that whoever butterfingered the ball, like, I mean, this is like, you know, this is actually kind of to kind of step outside of the realm of video games for a second, but it's like, you know, this is a thing that I think I heard it out of maybe out of like Alan Watts maybe, but it's like, you know, the theist and the atheist are like sitting in a bar, and the atheist says to the theist, you know, I tried the theism thing for like a hot minute. I was dying in the desert, and I said, God, if only you will save me, I will be faithful forever. And the theist says, well, you obviously got out of the desert. Why don't you believe? Right? Like it's like, well, two random strangers came along, you know, like two, you know, village people found me in the desert and brought me back. It wasn't God's doing at all. And the theist says, but that was God's doing, right? Like it's just kind of like a totally separated frame of mind. I don't know how Inquisition handles it, but I imagine that's kind of like the common trope there, right? That like,
yeah, I mean, so part of this, and I don't mean to get spicy on the podcast. Part of this is that with my Audible subscription, I've been listening to Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, which has put all of this stuff in the very forefront, right? Because obviously Richard Dawkins has absolutely no respect for theism in most of its forms. And he talks about like, okay, well, why does religion exist or whatever? And it's like, well, it exists because people see an uncompleted circle and they want to complete the circle, plus people respect authority figures, essentially, kind of thing, right? So, you know, theism conveniently answers unknowable questions for people, and people want to want good reasons to kind of like adhere to hierarchy and authority and structures. And so it was very clear to me every time somebody would ask me something like, are you the Herald of Andraste? And there was like a real pull to say yes, because you want to inspire like the fucking random ass soldier you're talking to or whatever, who is like literally putting their life on the line for you, and because they like believe in your cause. Like what are you gonna say to that person? Like, no, you know, the best I could do was like, I don't know, or whatever. And like just to kind of like feel that pull in a very like real way was very interesting. The craziest part, by the way, about this is that there's the whole back half of Inquisition is also simultaneously dealing with the elven gods who are like also there and like interact with things. And so like even though the first half of the game kind of disproves the inherent theism it suggests, right? At first, you don't really know if Andraste single-handedly saved you from the Fade and delivered you back with this, like, crazy mark, and then you find out, no, you just kind of walked through the Fade with the mark because that's what allowed it to do, and the only reason you had the mark in the first place was because of fucking Corypheus' Butterfingers. But then you like now you're actually going back and you're dealing with like, oh, the fucking reincarnated elven gods who I think are going to be the subject of Dragon Age 4. I don't really know the details as of yet. But yeah, man, I don't know. Dragon Age is such a fucking good game. Just because like, you know, it wants you to like think and consider this shit. It honestly reminds me a lot of the kind of like watershed moment I had when I was playing Mass Effect 2, and I was kind of like, oh my god, Mass Effect 2 is just kind of like, the whole point of Mass Effect 2 is to take every single thing in Mass Effect 1 and show you the other side of it. You know what I mean? It shows you the other side of the Geth. It shows you the other side of the what are they called, the terminus systems, like the lawless outlands that aren't part of Citadel space. It shows you the other side of Cerberus, who you're obviously like working for or whatever. It shows you the other side of the council, who are like completely deaf to the idea of the Reapers existing even in the first place. It shows you the other side of, I mean, it shows you the both sides of plenty of issues. And I think that like this is kind of another version of that. And even though I love Dragon Age 2 and I think Dragon Age Origins is okay, I don't even really think either of those two games kind of captured that as well as Inquisition has. So, I've been playing Inquisition. I've also been playing other stuff. But why don't you... What's going on in your life? Tell me all about it.
So, the two big games I've been playing are Beat Saber and Path of Exile. Path of Exile first. I'm still not super far. Every time I play this game, I end up playing it a little bit longer. Maybe eventually I'll get a character to max level. And essentially part of it is like, you know, you're faced with like 7 billion options. And at some point you have to say like, I'm just going to do what I'm going to do, and I'll worry about that later once I have like kind of the requisite knowledge built up. Because it's not like it's like hard, right? Like it's not like I've had any trouble with anything so far. It's not like if I'm making the wrong quote unquote, is it like it's this weird game where like it's this weird thing where like you're like, everything I've read says that like the big draw of this game is you can kind of truly do your own build in this game, but there are like kind of hard guardrails on it, right? Like if you don't have enough survival in your passive, have you seen the Path of Exile passive tree? It's like
no, but that's nuts.
It's crazy and massive. You should Google it if while I'm talking about it, just kind of like look at it. And it's like, you know, 1 billion nodes with like 1,000 like kind of different ways you could go about it. And there are wrong ways to build into that tree, but there are like an infinite number of right ways. Just kind of a matter of threading that needle. And you know, I think that there's
Jesus fucking Christ,
right?
What the? Oh my god! Okay, I actually recommend every single person go Google it. Because it shows you the tree. So it shows you the tree right on the Path of Exile site or whatever. But like, what it doesn't show you is it's scrollable. You can. This is insane.
Yeah. Each class starts at a different point on the tree, and you can kind of work your way around to different points on it. And it's all interconnected, and there's like tons of different things you can do, and all sorts of different builds you can do, and it's crazy like that. And there are like more and less layers of customization as you go on. Like there's different items, there are different skills aren't like tied to your class. They're like gems that you get that you can level up, and then there are support gems that modify those, and how things link are its own thing. And it's like. And there's like 10,000 different types of currency, and it's like it's like the biggest Diablo style wankfest that I have ever seen, and it's just a kind of like way to spend time. It hasn't been challenging yet, which is kind of like why I'm not as crazy about it so far. And I'm getting, like I said, I'm getting deep into it, so I'm hoping at some point I'll hit something a little bit more challenging. But it's if you I wanted to scratch that Diablo itch, and this let me do that. So I'm happy with it in that kind of sense. The other game I was playing, like I said, was Beat Saber. I've been really enjoying that. I've gotten some like it caused me to think.
Is Beat Saber like Guitar Hero, where you're doing it to real songs?
Yeah. Well, so the way this is the thing I wanted to bring up, right? Like, there's like maybe like 10 songs in it, but you could there are mods for custom songs, right? And I feel like the game isn't worth it if you can't mod in those songs, which is like its own interesting ethical dilemma. Like, technically, it's still in early access, so I think it kind of like dodges some of that. Like dodges, the fact that like it's not worth it for these like semi-illegal, like, I've got all sorts of copyrighted music in my game that like I play to. I don't think anybody paid a license fee for those, so whatever. But playing through it has made me the kind of stuff, like the actual steps that you go through are called maps, and I've got a lot of thoughts about like what makes a good rhythm game and like what makes a good map. And so it's just been interesting kind of thinking through these things. Like the first thing is I don't think that like a life bar is a thing that should be in rhythm games anymore. I think that's like, it's like the same kind of like holdover from the past, like from the arcades that we just haven't gotten past yet. I think eventually we will get past it. Like, I play with failure off anyway. It makes my score like half cost, so like I can't get any high scores, but I don't care. I just don't think it's fun. I'm very solid about this. I think that like there's no need, like, I don't care that much, but I don't think there's any need to discount my score because, if I'm not doing well, then I'm not going to get a high score anyway. It's not like it's just like that failure state, just like another level of weird difficulty on top of it. More controversial and something I'm a little bit less solid on is I don't think bombs should be a thing. This is a thing that's in a lot of different rhythm action games, but it's like basically places, like spaces that you shouldn't hit in Beat Saber. It's like a bomb that if you slice it, you take a hit and it resets your combo or whatever. And I don't think those are particularly fun. I didn't think they were ever fun in DDR when I was big into that. Again, you can also turn those off. I think that I don't think it's like solely true. Like, I've seen some cool moments in games that were kind of like mandated by bombs, but I think in large part they're just kind of like annoying. I also think that part of this is like some interface problems with Beat Saber itself. The bombs don't have any light behind them, and so they can be sometimes hard to see, like whereas the cubes are glowing. But like in terms of like what makes a really good map, I'm you know how we sometimes talk about like what difficulty is a game meant to be played at?
Yeah.
So I think that like the thing that I want is like there are difficulties that each map should be played on, and I think that's kind of like what makes you feel the most like a badass when you're doing it. And like there are difficulties that are higher and lower than that, but I think that's like actually kind of like peak rhythm game enjoyment. And the problem is that not every song is going to, like, there's some songs that naturally when you have the right kind of map to it, it's going to be a medium, and some where it's going to be a very hard, right? Like I think like some of the slower songs are naturally going to be easier, and as a result on like the harder settings there's just like a ton of superfluous stuff in there that you have to do, and I don't think it quite fits right well with the music. It's not as good of an experience, but I think kind of like ignoring a score and just like feeling like a badass is the best part of that game, especially when they do like a lot of mappers are good at like doing silly little gimmicks, which I think are like the highest part of the art form. Like there's this one of the songs that I saw that I could download was like a meme mashup, and it was not a great song, but the map was pretty good, and like things like there was a section where it played a segment from Eiffel 65's "I'm Blue," and it's only blue squares that come up, and I'm like, oh, that's funny, or like there was a song where it's like the song says something about like turning around, and so like the blocks were all backwards, right? Like you had to essentially hit the left block, or the blocks that correspond to your right hand. They were on the left side of the screen, which I think is really cool. I just think that the game's kind of really masterfully put together. I think that, like I said, like I kind of want to sit down and put together my thoughts, like what makes for a good map. There's actually a great community at a site called B Saber. I think it's Beast Saber is what the full name of the site is. And they're good at kind of like curating what's a great map and whatnot. And, as like, it feels so, it's so much fun to just kind of like dance around to like The Greatest Showman and like feel like you're kind of, like either in that, like, in like these films where like there's choreographed dance numbers, like, it's like you feel like you're kind of in that mode, even though you're not, or like you feel like, you're like the timpani player at the back of an orchestra. It just feels great. It's a lot of fun. I love that game. It's been a blast for the past week.
Wow. Okay. So I've been playing another game that I want to talk about. That I'm almost embarrassed to talk about, but I actually feel like that embarrassment is part of why we need to talk about it. So I bought The Sims 4 and one of its like expansion packs as part of like a holiday thing for like $25 or something like that. Have you ever played like The Sims?
No, I never got into it.
Okay, so I played the original Sims, and then I also played like The Sims 2, and I find all of these games like very compelling, in kind of like a little bit of like a Skinner box sort of way, but it also like a weird like Second Life way. You know what I mean? Like, because you get really attached to your Sims, and you want them to have like a good fun life with doing their things or whatever. But like, when I started looking into The Sims, did you know that The Sims was the best-selling game of both 2015 and 2016?
That sounds about right.
Why does nobody talk about this? You know what I mean? Like, holy shit, The Sims is being played all over apparently, and we never hear about it. I don't really know what that means, or what we have to.
I don't think it has a lot of traction with the enthusiast crowd, as it were, right? Like, like what was the best? What was the best kind of selling movie of 2015 and 2016? It's probably a Marvel movie, and that has some notoriety to it. But like,
so the best selling movies have been Star Wars movies. Last year was The Last Jedi. Then it was Rogue One. Then it was this year. I think it's going to be Infinity War, but maybe Black Panther. I don't really know which one got better.
Right.
I know that both of those crossed $1 billion. Aquaman is crossing $1 billion today, though I don't think it's going to beat either of those two. Obviously,
the point being that like the movies that like kind of like enthusiasts go ape shit for are not necessarily the ones that are the highest grossing. I think this is kind of like. I also suspect that, like, like in kind of like the demographics that it appeals to, it's probably like the only game that really get like, like it's not like there's a lot of like there's like an indie version of The Sims that like a lot of people would be clamoring for, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I want to amend, by the way, it is, to be specific, it became the best-selling PC game of 2014 and 2015. Not 2015, 2016. So that was my fault. I also think it is something that attracts teenagers. The most I am struck because I've played the original Sims, The Sims 1, and I've played The Sims 2, which both came out in the early 2000s. I'm struck by how much The Sims 4 seems rewired from the ground up to kind of be to kind of like attract, I guess, like young teenage kind, like the young kind of teenage crowd. Like the most recent expansion is called Get Famous. One of the jobs, one of the careers available to your Sims is as a social media influencer. And I feel like that very, you know, in the same way that like the original Sims let you become a superhero if you did the right stuff or whatever. And like you could say that's kind of like a power fantasy or whatever. Like I think the fantasy of The Sims as like a social media influencer still exists in like the modern, you know, like in like the modern day and age. But it's geared towards different, like, you know, different people, I guess.
Yeah. It's also weird because like it's not like it's like one of the top selling games of all time, which you might kind of expect, right? Like, you know, like
yeah.
I guess it just kind of dominates in its year. So I'm reading a headline that says it's the biggest selling franchise ever from like 2008. Maybe part of this is that like, you know, the PC itself is like a weird platform, right? Like
yeah. I guess I would say something like, you know, Pokemon or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Would but like that never touches PC, so it doesn't count.
Yeah. And even if it did, right, like Minecraft is big, but how much of that is console games?
Yeah.
And like I feel like it's hard to dominate in the PC market just because it's like a neat, like, it would not surprise me if a lot of this is that like The Sims can run on any PC that you have, whereas like the more hardcore games require an enthusiast PC to actually run.
Yeah,
it's interesting. Like I think the more that I think about it, I think the caveat that it's the best selling PC game is important and informative. I don't know what else. So how has your experience with it been?
Amazing. Because it's hilarious how this game works. It's mostly like it feels like a big blast from the past, honestly, for me. Because I played these games when I was like a kid, and they're not hard, or you know, like I can't even really put my finger on what's compelling about it. I think it's just the role playing game kind of like aspect of how this stuff works, and then like there's a very insidious, like, you know like I talked about the kind of like the Marxist critique. This is like the Marxist critique of The Sims, which is that the enjoyment that comes out of The Sims is just about like living a good capitalist life where you have money to buy things in it or something like that. Like maybe that's a piece of it. Like when, you know, you come home from work and you get your immediate like paycheck thing, and it's like tons and tons of money, and there's no rent in The Sims or anything kind of along those lines, it seems. So you're just like constantly like, oh well, I think I'll upgrade my television to like the super expensive flat screen television today or whatever. And it's like, so maybe like that's what it is. I really don't know. Part of it is just like running like a simulation of like my sim is me, right? And then I also have a sim for Rachel, and we're obviously like married. We are married, but in The Sims we're also married. But like now I'm like, oh well, now I need to make a sim for like all of our friends. Like, wonder if Sim Buddy will be friends with Sim Mango. Can we start a Sim podcast together? You know what I mean?
Is there a Sim Mango?
No, I haven't made a Sim Mango yet, though. I'm going to have to, I guess, at this point now. I'll have to update you next week. I'll play a little bit of Sim Mango over the course of the week so that you can.
This is like when
see how well you're.
Friend of the cast, Monik, apparently named his squad members after a bunch of us, and he's like, yeah. Mango and X died in my XCOM run, so you know there's that.
That's funny.
But yeah, no, it's interesting. I just could never get into like whenever I played The Sims, I would instantly like cheat a bunch and like I enjoyed it more as kind of like a sandbox than as like, you know, like in the way that like you could turn on creative mode in Minecraft. I never really appreciated it.
Yeah.
For, like,
I definitely did the same thing. I used to just like make houses. It was almost like an architecture simulator for me for a long time. But I've been sticking to the rules this time. And you know, we've been working our way up.
Yeah, like, can you even cheat in The Sims 4? I feel like that's a thing they lock behind, like a microtransaction or something.
I mean, you know, maybe I haven't tried. Let's check.
So while you're checking on that,
it looks as though there is a cheat code.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can cheat in The Sims like you cheat in Skyrim.
Okay. So you're a big fan of like of what is the show? The show with the lawyer. Better Call Saul.
Better Call Saul.
Yeah.
Yes, Better Call Saul. It is the best game on television, or it's the best show on television.
It's about like a really like shady lawyer, right?
Yes.
You might consider. I have not watched Better Call Saul, so I can't tell you how directly comparable it is. But you should consider watching on Netflix the show Rake. I talked about it a little while ago when I watched the pilot, and I've been watching other episodes going forward. It's about it's Australian law, so you know it's not quite the same legal system, which prevents me from being like, oh, this is not accurate at all. But it's like a lawyer that is a terrible person. In a lot of, like, he has a bunch of shitty clients. The cases aren't always the most compelling part, but there's also just kind of like this network of personal drama underlying it all. It's a great, I guess, black comedy is the right way to put it. Like a lot of the arcs are about like the main character Cleaver Green's kind of like romantic troubles. Like the first episode centers around like he regularly goes to a whorehouse and sleeps with this one whore, and then she quits, and then it turns out she's going to be a lawyer as well, and he like interacts with her in real life. It's very strange. And then he's got like he is longtime friends with his best friend's wife, and like that gets its own arc, and there's a lot of drama there. He's gotten his own ex-wife, and it's just like an absurd show that is hilarious and just like super compelling.
So, quick question: is it a legal drama? Like, is every episode scheduled around a like a case of the week, like Boston Legal, for instance, something like that? Ally McBeal.
So there is a different case every episode, and it drives part of the plot, but sometimes it's just kind of like secondary, like the drama about his personal life doesn't always follow from the case. Sometimes it does.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
And like I said, it's like I've watched like 6 or 7 episodes now, and like the case isn't always super compelling. The first episode, the case is great, it's also just about like kind of how he's like falling apart. It's a lot of it's about him, like, you know, what does he say in the first episode? It's like, you know, I don't care about what's right, I care about the law, kind of thing, right? Like,
oh my god,
yeah, yeah, and he's like kind of a skeezy guy, but like he's got like a heart of gold type thing. Although he does fuck up a lot, it's a good watch.
Yeah. Better Call Saul is more traditionally structured like a regular drama. There really are a couple of cases that get kind of resolved. But it isn't like it's not like episodic in that sort of way. But it is very much in the same sort of thing where it's like, I mean, the core. This is part of what makes Breaking Bad interesting as well, because so much of it relies on the sort of interesting, non-linear like thinking or lateral thinking of the protagonist. Like, because Walter White is a chemist, right? So and not like an accomplished drug dealer, he does stuff that is like crazy and unique for the drug trade because of his knowledge of chemistry, right? And in the same sort of way, because Saul is, or Jimmy for most of the show, because Saul is a con man who reforms into a lawyer, it's like interesting watching him solve like legal problems, but like with kind of con man methods, if that makes sense. There's also a secondary character, Mike Ehrmantraut, who is like a big character in Breaking Bad as well, but he also, is a former cop, and so he thinks about the drug trade differently than like other people think about it. And like that's when those shows are at their height, it is about that specific thing. It's about using those kinds of skills outside of their like intended, intended sort of like interactions or whatever. So that's interesting. Yeah, I actually know that Rake got remade in the U.S. with Greg Kinnear for like a season or something. Because I remember seeing like billboards and shit for it.
Oh, really? I don't know.
Yeah.
Well, the original Australian version is on Netflix, so you know.
Very cool. Very cool. I've been watching Community actually recently. Can we just like?
We should do like at some point maybe this year do like a rewatch of Community.
I would be so happy to do like a big retrospective on Community. It is insane how impactful from like a pop culture perspective Community has been. Like I keep seeing names, like you'll just see like scrolling in the credits. Like for instance, the composer on Community, the guy who does the music for Community, is a guy named Ludwig Göransson, who just broke into movies in a really big way because he's friends with Ryan Coogler and did the Black Panther soundtrack. And so like it was originally produced with the Russo brothers. Like they directed a bunch of like episodes, and now they are helming like the biggest movies, in the popular consciousness. Obviously, like there's all of these small guest stars that pop up, like like Brie Larson has like a couple of individual appearances or whatever. I'm just kind of like, Jesus Christ, this show, like, it's amazing how deeply rooted so much of our pop culture was in this from like 10 years ago at this point.
Yeah, and it's weird because it's like it wasn't like a particular like an exceptionally popular show, right? It's not like a Friends or a Seinfeld.
Yeah.
But it's just kind of like, but it definitely kind of had that lasting impact on the culture.
Yeah, I've heard quite a bit that it kind of came at the wrong time. Like now, for instance, the Nielsen company does ratings of online shows like Netflix shows and stuff like that. And so we have better ways to kind of like directly compare things like that. But I have heard kind of apocryphal stories about how, Community was like the number one show on Hulu, and it's the number one show on Netflix, like all this stuff. Because I remember in college, everyone I knew, we had all seen it, but none of us watched it on cable, obviously. Yeah. And like kind of that it was at a time and for a time that just like where its popularity couldn't be like measured. But yeah, we should definitely do a Community episode. Also, we are planning to do a Young Justice episode. The Young Justice season 3 has started airing. I think like 10 episodes deep or something.
Well, shit. I just get caught up on that then.
Yeah, so we'll need to. So that'll be sometime in the next couple of weeks. But this coming week's episode, we have announced. We have not announced. This coming week's episode is going to be a rewatch of The Last Jedi.
No, it might not be this week. Remember?
Oh, it might not be this week.
In the next 2 weeks, one of the 2 episodes will be a rewatch of The Last Jedi.
I just want to tell people, rewatch The Last Jedi because we're doing that in one of the next 2 weeks because it's still on Netflix. I have no idea when it's coming off of Netflix, but we got to go back. We got to go back to,
just to give you a preview, essentially like in the year since this passed, a lot of kind of like the pop culture criticism has come out. I have sensed myself drifting more negatively on that film, but I haven't watched it in a while, so I want to recenter myself on it. I also kind of want to go through the common criticisms of it and see how much we think any of them hold water. I'm going to be compiling a list out of both of Red Letter Media's reviews and the Vito Giswaldi review, which was very popular. I was watching him before it was popular, but it was one that got a lot of traction.
Oh, were you watching him before it was cool, Mango? Were you watching him before it was cool?
I got into him because he also had a video where he like went to one of the protests in Berkeley and handed out Pepsi as kind of like because that was around the time of that Kendall Jenner episode where she.
Oh my god, I remember that.
Yeah, and
she hands the cop a Pepsi. Oh my god.
So this guy, he buys some Pepsi. He's like, I'm going to solve this protest. and like first they won't let him in with the Pepsi, and then like he manages to sneak in with the Pepsi, and he hands it to a guy who like immediately like throws it at somebody on the other side. He's like, yeah, maybe that's why. So you know he's a fun guy to watch sometimes, but he had a very popular Last Jedi review that kind of trashed it in a bunch. If you've got any recommendation, like if you guys at home,
yeah, we'll have to compile because
Yeah.
I definitely have seen plenty of things. Like there's a Movies with Mikey episode, 2 episodes I actually think that were in the defense of The Last Jedi, and also there's a Movie Bob thing where he talks about The Last Jedi. His reading of the film is very close to my reading of the film in that it is ultimately a very uplifting story about like who the Jedi and like that Luke's character arc is like. You know, people misunderstand kind of like Luke's character arc. So yeah, we'll definitely compile a big fat list. Maybe we'll like tweet it out or something so that everybody can walk into this episode just like with all the research, all the fucking homework done.
Yeah, I feel like I've got a couple theories brewing into my head as to like not only like what I think of the movie, but like why the reaction is kind of how it is and why it's so polarizing around the movie.
Yeah, definitely. You know, I actually okay, we'll get into this, but just as a sneak peek, something that occurred to me the other day, because I was just like having a conversation about this at work, something that occurred to me the other day about the Last Jedi is that I actually think that the reaction reminds me a lot of the reaction to and the subsequent polarization of Man of Steel. And I am very interested to get into the nuances there, because the polarization with Man of Steel, to me, it all comes down to like taste, and I almost sort of wonder if it's the same thing, right? Like we all might agree that it is a kind of quote unquote quality movie, but people are misattributing their taste for quality in places, which is where it's going.
To give you a little bit of a hint on my nascent theory, I think it's in kind of tune with that is, there are like I don't remember exactly like what all my evidence for this is, but like it's essentially that the movie, like there are things in the movie that are good for the movie but bad for the universe, and I think that kind of falls into that paradigm that you're describing.
Oh yeah, that's really interesting. Oh my god, yes. Okay, anyway, I'm so excited. All right, but we're done.
Yeah, we have to wrap up. If you'd like to email us with any sources that you want us to look at for that episode, if you want to tell us what you think about like these motivation things we talked about in the main part of the episode, or any of the other stuff we talked about on this podcast, you can reach us at somederpsplaygames@gmail.com or podcast@somederpsplaygames.com. You can follow us on twitch.tv/somederpsplaygames. You can find us on iTunes. Leave us a 5-star review. All that other great stuff. That's everything I had.
Subscribe to the YouTube channel that we have. Yeah,
I keep forgetting to update. That's everything from me, buddy. Do you have anything else that you're looking to promote?
I have nothing else that I'm looking to promote.
In that case, until next time, dear listeners.
Until next time, loyal listeners.